Greenville Technical College's School of Arts and Sciences Speaker Series. Today we have a presentation by Mable Owens Clarke from Soapstone Baptist Church in Pickens County and Dr. John M. Coggeshall of Clemson University, and this is in celebration of Black History Month. Mrs. Clarke is community historian, chef, trained dietitian, deacon, and youngest member of the Soapstone Baptist Church. Her great-grandfather, Joseph Mcjunkin, who you see his picture here, founded the church and donated the land where it stands today. Dr. Coggeshall is a professor of anthropology at Clemson University, and he has written the book Liberia, South Carolina, an African-American Appalachian Community, published by UNC Press in 2018. His research interests include cultural history of the South Carolina mountains, traditional cultures in the Midwest and Carolinas, heritage tourism, gated communities, and ethical issues in ethnographic research. He's working on another book, soon to be published, Something in These Hills, about the meaning of land to insiders in the mountains of Upper South Carolina. And I'm sure Mrs. Clarke will also talk to us about the famous fish fry at Soapstone Baptist Church. So welcome to Liberia, South Carolina, an African-American Appalachian community. And again, I would like to ask you to mute your mics so we can focus on Dr. Coggeshall and Mrs. Clarke. And it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Dianne, for inviting us. I'm here in a room at Clemson University with Mable Clarke, and since I'm still learning how to use technology, I don't want to switch cameras and switch off the slideshow. So if you guys could bear with us, trust us, neither Mable nor I are cats. We are here in Clemson, and I'll put the camera on her when it's her turn to talk once we finish with the slides. So we really both of us appreciate being invited to do this speaker series, and we're excited about talking about this work. And of course, I know you guys want to hear Mable, so I'll be as brief as I can. As Dianne mentioned, this is a talk based on a book that Mable and I have collaborated with called Liberia, South Carolina. And what's critically important about this place in South Carolina, and what's important to kind of think about, is that Liberia is a place in the mountains of South Carolina that typically is seen as white space. If you think about the stereotypes associated with Appalachian people, you think about Scots-Irish white people, but what's critically important to remember is that almost literally from the beginning of white settlement, after Native Americans, of course, were kicked out, but almost from the very beginning, African Americans were here too. And so one of the themes that you're going to see sort of portrayed in this book is the struggle by African Americans to remain in this place. And so that's kind of what we're going to be. That's, to me, what's important. So Liberia, by its very presence, becomes a freedom colony, a place where African Americans can assert their identity, speak their own minds, say what they want to say within a protected space. And because it was this escape valve, so to speak, for African Americans to speak their own minds, whites saw it as a threat. And that threat continued throughout the history of this place. This is actually a photo of a man named Emerson Kemp. It's on the cover of the book. And the reason why I chose a photo from the late 1920s, and the reason why I chose this photo is for really two reasons. First of all, it's a picture of a man named Emerson Kemp in front of his house in Liberia. And so to me, this picture represents, in a sense, two things, both related to the ideas that I'm talking about. One is the fact that there were, and still are, African Americans in Appalachia more specifically in Upper Pickens County, South Carolina. And the other thing I like about this photo is his pose. If you look at the way he's casually standing, nicely dressed, maybe for Easter service or a Sunday service, that pose to me says, we're still here and we're not going anyplace. It's that attitude of self-confidence, that attitude of assertiveness, that attitude of agency, that we are not going to be denied our right to live here too. And that's why I chose that photo in the book. Okay, trying to advance the slides here. And nothing's working. There we go. To give you an idea of where Liberia is located, here's a map of South Carolina. And so we're focused on this very far northern part of Pickens and northern Greenville counties. A little bit more closer up, you can see here's the state line between North and South Carolina. Here's that tab of Greenville County coming in here. Table Rock is right here. And then you can see the area called Liberia is this area just to the north and east of Pumpkin Town, if you know where Pumpkin Town is. And who doesn't? I came upon, this is the county road going toward Liberia. As you can see Liberia Road. I came upon the community back in about 2006, 2007. I found the place name of Liberia on a map. I was researching another book at the time, and I thought this was an odd place name, a name associated with Africa, an odd place name for Upper Pickens County. So I set out to discover a little bit more about the community. I met Mable Clarke. We worked together to develop a way to present the story of Liberia. That's what this book represents. I've agreed to be the spokesperson for telling the story to a wider audience. Of course, Mabel's here too. But in exchange for that agreement, all the royalties from the sales of this book go back to the community. So any speaker's fees that I get, any royalties that the book generates, go back to the community. That's why we appreciate you buying it directly from the publisher. I'll give you a website to go to later on, rather than through Amazon. Because if you're buying through Amazon, we don't get royalties. So just an important safety tip, I guess. Oops. To give you an idea of what the place looks like, the area looks like, this is the Illinois Valley right outside of Pumpkin Town. This is better farmland. So this is where the Euro-Americans had settled. This is where the whites had settled in the better farmland. In contrast, this is the Liberia Valley. This is actually Mabel's family farm. And Liberia was off the main valley of the Illinois. And back in the late 19th century, or back in the mid 19th century, the land was deemed as not as good because it wasn't those flat floodplains that you just saw. It was hillier, poorer land. So this is where the freed slaves were placed. Now, it's important to think about why Liberia Valley, off the main valley, was out of sight of whites. They're still relatively close to where the African Americans had been enslaved, and yet off the main valley. And so what that meant was African Americans could have their own enclave, their own freedom colony, out of sight of their local former white master. It allowed them to live their lives the way they wanted to, out of white eyesight, literally as well as metaphorically. And that becomes important. Whoops. This is the old Soapstone Church, built in the late 19th century. The church was established right after the Civil War. And then by the 19th century, late 19th century, this building was built. And this building is no longer standing for reasons that we will talk about. Oh, hang on a second. Oops. Now I get it. All right. This is the new Soapstone Church and Table Rock in the background. This is the one-room schoolhouse that was built around 1928 or 1929. This is the school that Mable also attended. This is the black school. Whites, of course, had their own schools. This is the slave cemetery. There's two cemeteries on the site. One is the slave cemetery, where there were some enslaved people buried after the freed and some enslaved people. And then, of course, there's the newer cemetery as well. All right, so in order to tell the story of Liberia, as Dr. Chidester explained, I am a cultural anthropologist, so I use slightly different methods than historians do. I talk to people. I also used a lot of secondary documents. I used the census records to trace the residents of Liberia back to 1870, as far back as I could go, because of course in 1860, they were enslaved, they had no names, so it's very difficult to trace back, although I was able to, some people. I also used family histories that allowed me to go further back in time, and then some other kinds of documents. I found a really interesting biography of a woman named Aunt Katie, whom I will introduce you to in a little bit more detail coming up. Excuse me, her biography was actually published in, I think it was the Pickens Sentinel, after she died in the 1920s, and it demonstrates how important a person she was, both to Black and white communities. I found a will from about 1848, 1850, that described a woman, an enslaved woman named Cheney, who was given as a dowry in a white person's wedding. She was given to somebody else, a Hester. She was given to that man named Hester, along with her 4-year-old son, Emerson. Emerson grew up to be an enslaved overseer of the Hester family. After the Civil War, he was freed. He spent his entire life in Liberia, and that's his picture on the cover of the book as an old man. So I've been able to trace him. Another really interesting document that I came upon was a labor contract in 1865. And I'll be very brief in explaining the importance of these labor contracts. In March 1865, of course, the enslaved people in Upper Pickens County planted the crops of the white landowners. October 1865, of course, the African Americans were freed. The former white landowners needed their crops harvested, but of course, African Americans aren't going to work for free anymore. They need to be paid. The former white slave owners had no money to pay them. And so over and over again throughout the South, white people wrote up these labor contracts under Reconstruction, these labor contracts that spelled out the conditions under which African Americans were now willing to work with compensation. And so very typically all over the South, a significant amount of that compensation was in land. And of course, the former white slave holders are not going to give their former slaves the best land. They're going to give them the less important land, which is how Liberia got started. And we'll come back to that labor contract too. Briefly, a little bit about the community history. According to the slave census, there were over 4,000 enslaved human beings in what was then Pickens District. That's today Pickens and Oconee counties. So as I like to say to my undergraduates, erase forever from your mind that there were no Blacks in Upper Pickens County, and absolutely false. 4,000 enslaved human beings prior to 1865. After 1865, they're not going to go anyplace. They need to stay close to where their homes are. They need to stay close to where they're used to farming the land. And so again, there was that land exchange after 1865. The community was founded after 1865, again, primarily by whites trading land for labor. But remember, it's out of sight of most of white control. This was an unusual place because there were typically throughout the South these freedom colonies established over and over again. So this is not unusual in that regard, but it was unusual in the sense that relatively few, again, given the South in general, relatively few African Americans actually owned the land that they farmed. Most African Americans, and of course a lot of white Americans, were tenant farmers or sharecroppers, but the Liberia people owned their land, which again makes them a threat to white domination. One of the interesting challenges, of course, is figuring out how this African place name got into Upper South Carolina. So there's a couple of possibilities. Mabel's great-grandfather on her mother's side talked about having come from a place in Africa called Liberia, and thus that's how the place got its name. It's a possibility, although that's a long time to remember, and Liberia as a country wasn't established until I think the 1820s. It's a possibility. More likely, though, what I think explains the name is that Liberia, South Carolina became a metaphor for what was going on in Charleston after 1865. There was a movement to send freed slaves back to Africa. That's how Liberia had established itself and was established in the first place. Liberia, Africa was established in the first place. And so, sort of as a metaphor, instead of sending them back to Liberia and Africa, we create this new Liberia in the United States. It's a possibility. During Reconstruction, of course, when civil rights were restored to African Americans, not restored, were given to African Americans, the community expanded. About 28% of the population of the Pumpkintown Census District was Black, and that's a significant percentage of people just in that immediate Pumpkintown district. However, that number gradually declined after 1890. The reason for that is after 1890, Ben Tillman is governor of South Carolina. The South, of course, Reconstruction ends. The South goes back to very restrictive Jim Crow legislation. That makes being an African American throughout the South, let alone South Carolina, really difficult. Voting rights are taken away. Segregation comes back in. Everything's segregated again. So it was a tough time, of course, to be an African. Plus, of course, you had all the terrorism and things like that. So a lot of African Americans fled the South for northern cities, New York and Chicago and Cleveland, Boston, fled to the north because conditions were better there. And so that led to added to that kind of decline. Sometimes, of course, they were also forced out, as we'll see. As an example, in April 1967, Soapstone, that old building that I showed you, that original church, not the original church, but that wooden building, late 19th century, was burned by local Klans people. It barely made the paper, and I'll talk about that. And so that's why it took me a long time. So consequently, because of all these push-pull factors, there's very few people left in Liberia today, and Mable can certainly talk about that. Now, during my research, I've been able to document the lives of several very well-known Liberia residents back into their life under slavery also, relatively rare. Emerson Kemp, I told you about, I've been able to track him through several generations. Another person that I've been able to track is a man named Joseph Mcjunkin. That's Mabel's great-grandmother on her mother's side. Joseph Mcjunkin founded Soapstone Church after 1865. But the best known person whose life I've been able to trace is this woman. Actually, a photo of her. This woman, Aunt Katie Owens, was born about 1840. Don't know exactly when because she was born in slavery. She died in 1920, and it was her obituary and her life story that I read about in the Pickens papers. She was a very well-known person. She was a midwife. She did laundry for white families in the area, and she was a community matriarch in ways that I can talk about. What's interesting to me is she spent all her life in the Liberia area, almost literally adjacent to the families, white families who had enslaved her. And so one of the interesting questions to think about,
Please.
somebody, if you could, thanks. What's really interesting about this woman's life, as I said, she spent all her life in the surrounding area, near her former enslavers, and probably people who had sexually assaulted her at one time too. So why would she do that? That's an interesting question to think about. Aunt Katie had several children, one of whom married this woman, Rosa Glenn Owens. She died in 1941. And what's, among other things, interesting about her is she was widowed, but she had taken a loan out and for compensation. She mortgaged her land. Whites called the loan back, and so Rosie lost all of her farmland because she wasn't able to repay the loan. Actually, less than $1 an acre. That's what she owed, less than $1 an acre, but she couldn't pay it back because she was a widow with a lot of kids, and she lost her land that way. So that was one of the forces that whites were using to drive African Americans out of the area. Because remember, this was seen as a escape valve, a place where African Americans had that little sense of freedom. Rosa had several children, one of whom was this man on the, I guess it's on, well, anyway, the man, Chris. He married the granddaughter of Joseph Mcjunkin, the man who founded Soapstone Church, Lula. And Chris and Lula were community residents in Liberia. They were extremely important leaders, as you'll hear Mable talk about her mother, and they both died early in the 21st century. They had a number of children, the youngest of whom is this woman, whom you'll be hearing about very shortly. Okay, now, I wanted to write this book not only to tell the story of Liberia, but also to talk about the importance of this story to a wider audience. And so I'm drawing upon several ideas or several themes that remind us that the story of Liberia is not just a story of one place in South Carolina, but it tells us something about human behavior, not only in South Carolina, but human behavior in general. And so what does it tell us? First of all, one of the themes that I talk about is the idea that we need to erase forever from our minds the idea that there is one historical truth. Instead, there are alternate truths depending on who tells the story. And so a perfect example of this is Liberia. In the local white histories, Liberia is presented as living in perfect harmony with their white neighbors. And of course, when you actually talk to people in Liberia, you'll hear, no, that's not true. There have been many conflicts, again, as you predict, in the Jim Crow South in South Carolina. But who tells their story? That's the idea. Another good example is how was Liberia's land acquired? According to local white histories, the land was given to their former slaves, implying out of the goodness of their heart. But remember that labor challenge. The white people had no choice but to surrender some land to their former slaves to compensate them for their work. But notice the difference. If you argue that that white people generously gave the land, that puts white people sort of in charge, and Black people are subservient. Thank you for giving us this gift. On the other hand, if you think about African Americans asserting their right to be compensated, that puts agency back in the hands of these former slaves, an important idea, which I'll come back to. And of course, another perfect example of multiple truths is the fact that I said, remember that Soapstone Church, that old building that I showed you, was burned in 1967. Buried on page 8 of the Greenville News in April 1967 is a tiny little 10-line story headlined brush fires in area. And oh, by the way, Soapstone Church was burned too. That's the erasure of Black stories from the white narrative. So again, one of the benefits of bringing these stories to light is it allows African Americans to tell their own stories. Another really important concept that I use is a concept from Black feminist theory called other mothers. Other mothers are women in Black communities who, by helping to protect their own children, end up benefiting the community itself. And Mable, of course, has several stories about that. Another theme that I draw upon is this idea of power and resistance to power. Typically, when we think about power, we think about power from the top down. That is the kind of imposition of control by those in power against those without power. But more and more today, social scientists are thinking not only about what it's like to have power from those in control, but they're also thinking about strategies of resistance. How those without power, apparently without power, resist. And so it's important to tell the stories of resistance to power as well as the stories of those with power and how it's imposed. And so let's look at some examples. I said, remember that from the point of view of African Americans, Liberia was a safe haven, a place to speak your own minds out of sight of whites. And so that explains why over and over again, white people have tried to drive blacks out of these safe havens. They've taken Rosie Owens' land. They've burned the old Soapstone Church. As you'll hear, they've done things to Mable and her family. And so over and over again, African Americans have had to defend space that's rightfully theirs. And so how do they do it? What forms of resistance do they take? So some of those forms of resistance are physical, as you'll hear. Some of them are resistance to that kind of culture of terror that was typical of Jim Crow South. So actual lynching, shootings, again, that kind of assault that you'd that you sort of anticipate would be there, and resistance to those kinds of assaults. Plus, of course, it's not only the actual physical assaults, but it's also stories about those assaults. Stories about if you don't obey, you could have this happen to you too. That's another form of control, of course. But then an even more important kind of control is control of ideas. So think about those of you, all of us have been educated, of course, in some form or another. Think about what we learned about Reconstruction. Think about how often we've heard that Reconstruction was a disaster, right? But notice who's telling that story. It's a disaster if you were a former white slaveholder in the South, but it wasn't a disaster if you were an African American, especially males, who now could vote, hold public office, attend public school, which you were going to pay taxes for anyway. So Reconstruction was a very important part of this early civil rights movement. And yet, if it's only whites telling the story, again, what's that image? Who controls the writing of history books? And then let's think too about that phrase from that labor contract that I talked about. Let's think about that labor contract, because that's another really good example of resistance to power. I mentioned these labor contracts were very common in the late 19th century as a form of laying out specifically the kinds of requirements that former slaves would need to be compensated for their work. And I found one of these labor contracts in the Pickens County Museum from 1865, October 1865, from a landholder in Upper Pickens County. And the contract, the labor contract, was written out, standard clauses, again, it was standard all throughout the South because of the Reconstruction government, but clause after clause after clause, all written in a nice, neat handwriting. And then in the margin of that contract, written in a different color ink, in a different color ink, in the margin of that contract, showing that it was an addition to those standard phrases, were 4 words. And those 4 words spoke volumes to me, because those 4 words were, and their own crops. Why is that so important? Imagine in October 1865, a lawyer or the landholder, the landowner, reading this contract to his former slave, who could not read or write, remember? That was against the law. And in fact, they signed the contract with excellence. They couldn't write their names. So imagine them reading this contract to his former slave. And they're reading through all the clauses. Yes, we agree. Yes, we agree. Yes, we agree. And they come to a clause about who owns the crops that are being harvested. And those former slaves interrupted that white lawyer, and they said, we also want the fruits of our own garden and their own crops. And so think about the kind of agency that demonstrates, that these former enslaved human beings had the strength of character to stand up to their former white landowner and say, wait a minute, we want this too. And notice too that it demonstrates that even under slavery, they already had that strength of character, that resistance to power. They already had that. It didn't just pop out of nowhere in October 1865. They already had that resistance. And so to me, those four words demonstrate volumes about the relationship between former slaves and their former landowners. So what kind of lessons can we learn from this one little spot in South Carolina, as I said? If you think about it, resistance to unequal power is what our country was founded on. That's one of our most treasured values, right? Resistance to power. And so you can think about the story of Liberia as not only part of South Carolina history, but part of US history in a much more general way. And to me then, the story of Liberia, or because of that, the story of Liberia is a story for everybody, not just those of us in South Carolina, but it's a story of the power of the human spirit to rise above oppression over and over again and persist and be here today. So I'm going to let Mable talk about her legacy. I'll come back to this website if you're interested. We can talk more about the book later, but I know you want to hear from Mable too. She can flesh out some of these stories and episodes. I think Dianne wants to have questions at the end of the talk, so if you guys don't mind waiting. What I'm going to do now is get out of screen share. I'm going to switch the camera over to Mable, so bear with me a minute. Let's hope this works. Oh, it's on you. It's already on you. All right. So there's Mable Clarke.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. I am so excited to be here on Zoom. And I especially want to thank Dianne from Greenville Tech inviting me to come to speak to you and share some of the rich history that lands out there at Soapstone Baptist Church. First, I would like to say I am Mable Owens Clarke, affiliated with the Soapstone Baptist Church, and the pastor of the church is the Reverend Chidester, who has been with us for 10 years. And at this time, I also want to give thanks to Dr. Mike Coggeshall, who has been so grateful. We have been locked in for perhaps 4 to 5 years, getting the history together on the book, Liberia, South Carolina, which you all will have an opportunity to purchase. But I am just so happy for those of you that have shown interest this morning to let us present on Zoom the history of Soapstone Church. I will start first kind of explaining to you, which is always asked, why is the church named Soapstone? So I'm going to give you a little history here. Soapstone Church name come from, it's a soapstone rock. It's an outgrown crop at Soapstone Church, which is on 6 acres of land. And it's the soapstone rock is all over the place. And the Indians was the first that was on the land. And they used the soapstone rock to make their pottery. But first you have to understand, the soapstone is a real soft rock that they could develop into all kind of different artifacts. And as time went on, they had the soapstone mine is directly on the soapstone property there and directly in back of the Soapstone Church. but due to so many boulders there, the Soapstone mine started closing in, and we had to eventually just make it closed up because the boulders, the hunters and everything would go in there to sleep from time to time, and we were just so afraid that someone wouldn't get out of there. But what happened to the Indians? The Indian was ran off the land up into Cherokee. And at that time, after the Indian was gone, they brought in the free 600 slaves. And my great grandfather, Mcjunkin, he came up with the idea and said, we have to have a church. And he cut down trees and made a brush harbor. And he called the name Soapstone Church. So just to give you some idea that you won't have that in your mind where the name Soapstone came from. And as time went on, the free slaves were able to plant cotton and different vegetables, and they pooled their money together, and they was able to buy some lumber, and they built Soapstone Church. They no longer have to have service under the brush harbor. But as that particular church I was baptized in as a young girl at the age of 10, and I'm very connected to Soapstone Church. But as Dr. Coggeshall already referred to you, the church was burned in 1966 by the Clemson. But let me just share something with you this morning. Out of every bad thing that happened, there's always a way to bring some good to it. So the next Sunday, all the members and the pastor gathered there on the ground and looked at the ashes. And the pastor made a suggestion that all of them should perhaps just disperse and find a church of their choice. But my mother, Lula May Owens, spoke up, and she said, no way. Soapstone Church will be rebuilt. And let me tell you how that happened. And the members did question my mother and saying, we have no money. We have no money. How can we possibly build a church? She said, we will build this church back. So my parents was farmers. I grew up on a big farm. We're not talking about a garden. We're talking about fields. And so my parents planted a lot of vegetables, and they would go out on a route every Saturday, which they had been doing for years before the church was burned, and selling off their vegetables. So my mom would carry a little book with her, and she would ask her clients, and they would back then they call it peddling. So many young people don't even know what that expression means. It means selling off your goods. So she carried a little notebook with her, and she would say to them, my church has been burned. Could you please just give me a few dollars to help buy some cinder blocks? And she said, but if you don't have it, and she would use the word, it's much obliged. And it took me for a minute to really, over years, to understand what that word meant. It meant that it was okay. Thank you anyway. But let me tell you, I want you to stay with the story. The church was burned in 1966. In 1967, my mom and daddy from selling vegetables had the doors of Soapstone Church rebuilt and open. And that is the church, that's where we serve service every Sunday. And I'm hoping that all of you at some point has the opportunity to come and walk those grounds and view that church. Now I want to move on from that to let you know, talk about the school. I went to the little one-room schoolhouse there up until the 5th grade. And at that time, let me just do a sidebar here if I could, please. When I first went to school there in the 1st grade, which we live really next door to the church, that's where the farm is. I thought once I went to school there in the 1st grade, and the one-room schoolhouse, one teacher, that I could just get through, since she started with the 1st grade, I could get through and run on back home and do absolutely nothing. But trust me, that didn't happen. I had to stay there till the whole class was over around 3 o'clock. But let me tell you what advantages that had for me. By the time I got into second grade, since I had to sit there, I knew what it was about. When I got to the third grade and ongoing, so I was really ahead of most of the students. And so it really is not a bad thing for a one-room school. And sometimes today I look at the way the situations are going in school and academically how some of the students is kind of drifting back, especially during this pandemic. They trying to do school virtually and they kind of struggling with it. Even the teachers are struggling with that today. So, but we used to, with the one-room teacher, she would cook our lunch and we had to run down to, we had no running water and we had no bathroom facilities inside, which was it called an outhouse. So we would run down to the spring during recess and bring the water up so she could cook our lunch and we would be outside playing until she finished cooking our lunch. But I tell you, I don't think it's too many teachers today would do that. So they decided, the government decided to close the school when I entered into the 5th grade. And they came to my mom's house and said to her, you would have to, the government's gonna close the school and you would have to do homeschooling and I would be dropping off some books in a couple weeks. My mom says, no way. My children will get the same education as any other child. So he said, well, they're going to close the school, Mrs. Owens. So my mother, that Monday, he came on a Friday, Monday, Mom said, my mother did not drive. And she said to Dad, you're going to have to drive me to Pickett. I'm going to go out there and speak to the superintendent. We got to do something about this, my children get an education. She said, you and I have to run the farm and we do not have time to do homeschooling. So they went to Pickens and talked to the superintendent. The superintendent said, well, that's what the government said. And my mother said, write down, I know the Columbia is where the headquarters are. Could you just write down the address on a piece of paper? And she walked out and she left. So on the way home, she said, Dad, she said, she always called him Dad. So we're going to go to Columbia Monday. And my dad said, Lula, we don't know nothing about Columbia. And I don't even know it's so right, we white truck to even make it there. And said, we don't know even how to get there. She said, we'll stop at every gas station and keep asking until we get there. And sure enough, to make a long story short on that, they got down there and they made it back and they was gone all day. And I tell you, she left particular artists that we would, feed up all the catalysts and all that. Now dark is coming. And finally we hear the old truck coming down the road. And we ran out, Mom, are we going to be going to school? And she said, they're going to have a school bus that's going to come and pick you up. So sometimes you just got to press on. You got to press your way. So we got school bus and they would pick us up at 6:30 and we got bus from Pickens to Eastwood. So I just thank my mother for being so driven to see that we got an education. But I want to, I know for the sake of time, I want to get a lot in. But if I could just share with you a little bit about, I think I want to talk about slave cemetery, then I get into my life. Okay, the free slaves was buried in the woods there at Soapstone, out into the woods. I had never had the opportunity to go there as a child, and my parents, they always said it was too painful, even though we asked and we wanted to go. But as I became an adult, and a few years ago, I had to have the church land surveyed because we felt that someone was cutting the timber off the land. And exactly the surveyor came to my house and said, the church has lost pretty much all their timber. But he said, I came up on a lot of graves, just a thick the forest. And I think you should go there. I said, oh, yes, I do. I said, I always wanted to go to see the slave cemetery. He said, okay, come with me. He took me there and we walked through the thicket of trees and everything. And we finally got there to see some graves. And let me tell you, after leaving there, I felt so compelled, so touched. And I did a lot of praying and said, Father God, what can I do? I've got to do something. And about the second week after my mind just rolling, I sent a letter out to several different churches and asked them if they would come and help me cut a path in there to the slave cemetery so we could get some visions of what's out there. And let me just tell you, and I told them, if you can just come and help me, where I'm being a chef, I will fix you the best lunch you ever had. So I gave them a date, and it was on a Saturday, and told them to arrive at 7:30. I had 35 people with chainsaws, bulldozers, and everything that you can just imagine. And we started cutting a path there. Now it's 12 o'clock, and we have not even gotten into the cemetery. And we came back to the church, and I gave them lunch, and I thanked them and said, I appreciate you trying to help me. And they said, and for coming, we'll come back another time. They said, oh no, we're going to at least leave one grave before we leave here today, even if it's midnight. We went back, and around 3 o'clock, we were able to get, they kept cutting in, and we were able to see the cemetery. And after that, we had another meeting, and today we have a cul-de-sac that's cut in that I went to the county, and we got a cul-de-sac in there, and we have shrubberies planted there, and kiosks. If I'm not on the premises at the time, you can drive in and read the kiosk and walk in and view this cemetery. And I was just so grateful that I was compelled to make sure that to give those slaves some dignity and be a voice for them that they was not able to have. So moving on from that, I'm going to go and talk to you about my life growing up out on Liberia Road, down the road from Soapstone Church. I grew up in a real strong Christian family. I'm child number 8. And my parents did a lot of farming. That was the only means, a way to feed us. But let me just tell you what happened on one Sunday afternoon. And it's just like a picture that's still so present in my face and in my heart and in my mind. We left church on this particular Sunday, and my dad told my mom, said, you and the children walk on home. I'm going to take the truck and drive to Marietta and check on my sister because she was sick and see how she's doing. We went home. We had our normal Sunday dinner. So now we're sitting out on the porch because it's not a lot to do. We didn't have a lot of toys or anything to play with. So we sitting out there on the front porch, just swinging in the gliders and enjoying a normal Sunday afternoon. All of a sudden, we hear gunshots ringing out. We looked down the dirt road. We didn't have a paved road there. We looked down the road. We saw Uncle Clarke running, and the gunshots were still ringing out. So my mama jumped up. She said, something's wrong. Said, Uncle Clarke was an old man. He made it to our house, and he said, where's Chris, which is my father? Mom said, he's not here. He's in Marietta. He said, they just shot a hole in my bucket while I was milking up for evening, and told me that they were out of the farm no longer belonged to me. They ran me over. They have taken my farm away from me. And they're on their way here to take this farm, your farm over too, he said to my mom. My mom said to my brothers, Dad always have told you boys, if he wasn't home, to make sure you know what to do. Said, boys, get the guns. We can't lose the farm. We can't lose the house, but we have nowhere to go. So they gathered up the guns real quickly. And Mom said, I know how to go through the woods, and I'm going to try to cut them off before they get to the house here and take this farm over. So now she lined them up. The oldest one, it kept in line, the youngest one had the bag of ammunition in the back, and the rest of them had the guns. Mama was in front, and Uncle Clancy was behind. So she said, "You girls get underneath the bed." I'm 10 years old, which I hope no 10-year-old ever have to go through anything like this. So they went through the woods, but before they left, Mom didn't have a gun. She ran to the barn and got the pitchfork. And I was listening to her giving instructions. And she said, "Nobody talk." And she said, "When I raise the pitchfork up in the air, I want you all to let the bullets roll." But listen at the Christian in her, the Lord in her heart and in her soul. She said, "Keep the bullets low. Do not shoot at the head. They can always go to the hospital and get patched up." But sure enough, they made it there. They got up close. They had a shootout. Matter of fact, the men were sitting there drinking some beer, leaning up against the car, refreshing themselves up to come on and take our farm over. So they got shot up, went down to the Punkintown store where Mr. Burgess ran, and they asked him to get a mob up. And he said, "I will. But we want you to get a mob up and help us to go out there and kill all those N people." And so he said, "The Owens." So Mr. Burgess said, No. Those are good people. They have been trading with me here in this store for decades." And said, he warned them. He said, "But if Mr. Chris Owens loved his family, you will not get out of there the way you expect to." So after they bandaged up and bleeding and all of that, they left. Mr. Burgess got on the phone and called the sheriff and said, "You need to get out here right away. There's problems out here." So the sheriff came, and my dad done made it back home now. The sheriff came, and he was really a cussing old sheriff. I mean, he didn't mean it in no kind of form, and said to my dad, "Chris, what the hell is going on out here?" He said, "Well, they want to take the farm over and run us out." So he opened up the trunk of his car, and he said, "Tell one of them boys to bring a paper sack out here and bring the guns out." He said, "I'm only one on this weekend, and I can't stay out here." He said, "But they're gonna be back soon as dark comes." He said, don't lose your farm, Chris, like some of the other Black families have." So he loaded up a paper bag with all the ammunition in it, and gave instructions to my brothers what to do. And sure enough, as soon as it got dark, 9 o'clock, here come the car coming up the little dirt road. And then so my dad said, there they come. And he said, "But my dad instructed my brothers, let them shoot first." They started shooting. The window panes started going out of the house. And Dad said, "That's okay. We can replace the windows. Let them get a little closer." And as soon as they got close enough, my dad said, "Now it's time, let's go." But make a long story short, it took care of that. We were able to keep the farm. Clarke Glenn was able to keep his farm. So those are some of the things that I grew up with as a child, that I just kind of just don't really, some things you happen that you just can't wrap your arms around. And so in saying all that, everything got peaceful after that. I guess the word got out that, they just couldn't come in and just take somebody's farm over. Now I'm going to,
God bless you.
and people often say, "Mable, what drives you at Soapstone Church?" I am driven because on those grounds, which my mother always called God's little holy grounds, I grew up, my roots are there. And I feel so compelled that I have to have a voice in the community. Matter of fact, they say, maybe the community say, "You are the matriarch. You are the glue to keep this community together. But I just want to share with you also, the community has came together so well that I have a sister church up the street called Pleasant Road. They closed their church one Sunday out of the year and come to Soapstone. We closed our church one Sunday out of the year and go to Pleasant Road. But in saying that, how we are just so connected. And I wish the nation could just see how we interact out there at Soapstone. And just in saying that, Soapstone to me, it's a rock. It's a rock that you just so glued to. It's no way of breaking away from. It's happiness is where you want to be. And that's where I am. My life is not defined about the ups and downs that I went through. I would not allow that to say who I am, because I am bigger than that. So in saying that, they often say to me, why do you do the fish fry? The church has like 9 members. A church cannot survive with 9 members. But when I was a little girl, the whole church would fill up. But so many people left Liberia out there because it was it was just no growth there. It's no growth unless you just continue on to be in the cotton field. And they left, went north, or went to different places for a better life. At 17, I ran away too. I ran away to Boston. I was gone for 23 years. And I made my way back to Soapstone. And when I came back, I saw the membership had diminished so greatly. And I saw the need not to let my great-grandfather's legacy die. And I had to find a plan. And I started a fish fry. I don't even know why today I call it a fish fry, but I just felt that was the easiest thing that I could do, the easiest thing to cook, and probably something that people would enjoy eating. But just let me tell you, the fish fry has outgrown me. It went from fish to ribs to chicken and everything that you could just imagine. And we probably got a hot bar there that's as large as Golden Corral. But in saying that, my mother lived to be 104 years old. My dad made 107. And here I stand to speak to you today at the age of 78. My mother and father both became paralyzed. I left my job. I refused to put them in a nursing home. And I took care of them. My mother called me to her bed. And this is really a hard story to tell. And I promised Dr. Coggeshall I will not cry today. Usually I'm really broken by this. She called me to her bed, and usually when she called me to her bedside, usually she wanted something from the refrigerator, something because she couldn't get up. I said, okay, Mom, what you want from the kitchen? She said, baby, I don't need anything from the kitchen. I'm getting ready to go home to sleep in Jesus' arms. She said, my time is up. And I looked my mother in the eye and said, Mom, you're not going anywhere. She said, but she put 2 fingers up in the air. And she said, I need you to do 2 favors for me. Now she said, out of the 8 children that I have, you have never refused to do anything I asked you to do. And she said, now, number 2, I want you to go to Greenville, to Scott Tower, and get your oldest brother, who is paralyzed and cannot do anything for himself. I want you to bring him home to the family house, make it handicap accessible for him. And I want you to take care of him until God sent him home to me. Now, she said, now, number 2, your great-grandfather was the founder of Soapstone Church. And when he only had service underneath some bushes, do not let those doors at Soapstone Church close. And she asked me for my hand, and she gripped it so tight. And she said, look me in my eye. Will you make that promise to me and that promise to God? I said, yes, ma'am. Let me tell you, 3 days later, the angels came and got Mom, and she just flew away at 10 o'clock in the morning. So that's why I'm so driven with Soapstone. That's why I'm so locked in. That was a promise that I made to her and a promise that I made to God. So that is why I do what I do at Soapstone. That's why I have a fish fry. And I thank God that we were able to pay the mortgage off there. But even with that gone, utilities still has to go on. The last fish fry we had was in October because of pandemic. But I know that with utilities going on, and with now it was used to have 9, now we're down to 6 members. I have to start back up with the fish fry. I will open back up on March the 20th. And it would be a drive-through fish fry. We would be pandemically safe. And people would be able to walk in past the hot bar, and they will not be, we would have no seated inside to be able to take it home. But if the weather provides, with good weather, we would have some tables set up outside, a space 6 feet plus away from each other, because it's 6 acres of land. So we got plenty space to put you. So I would like to invite those of you, if you have never visited Soapstone, I plead to you and I challenge you, come visit me. And the view out there is picturesque. Where the church sits, you walk out onto that big soapstone boulder. You view into Table Rock, and also you view into Cease's Head. And you'll be able to walk the grounds. The grounds is just, oh, the grounds is just, it's just believable. I'm just gonna say that. You got to come and see it. But in saying all that, I'm gonna get to my closing remarks and want to thank you all for viewing with us today. Oh, let me just pause for 1 minute. It's one thing I forgot. We had a sculpture that came in from out of the country. And he had read the story with me in the Eating Well magazine. And he was so inspired to travel and come to Soapstone. He builds sculptures from all around the world. And matter of fact, when I leave here, I'm going there to meet with him where he's building the sculpture here, and to give him permission to go ahead with the casting of the sculpture. And we hope that we'll be able to unveil that sculpture around the first week in March, because he has to travel back to his country. I want to take this time to thank Greenville Tech, to thank Dianne for reaching out, to let me tell the story of Soapstone. And I hope to see each one of you that's viewing here on Zoom. Come see Mable. I would love to see you. And may God bless each one. And stay safe.
Okay, Dr. Coggeshall, do you have anything else that you want to add at this point?
No, I think we can open it up for questions. I know you guys are eager to talk to Mabel. I'm trying to zoom in on her there.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much. I knew some of the story, but I hadn't heard really Mabel's story, and so that was just really powerful and very moving for me. So I want to thank you for sharing that with us. So I guess one of the I have questions that were submitted by some faculty, questions submitted by students as well. So one of the first questions I have, and it just kind of ties in here, Mrs. Clarke, you've told us about some of the really tough times. What's your happiest memory growing up in Liberia?
I would say my happiest memory growing up is on a Sunday afternoon. My mom would take us to my grandmother's house, which was all the way up at Ball Rock. And we would walk for 6 to 7 miles to get there. And she would always have some food cooked for us, and it was just wonderful. After church, we knew that was our little trail through the woods. But you know, Dianne, I think about walking 6 miles to that distance. To us, it was just fun. We never even thought of it as 6 miles. And if you say that to me today, Mabel walked 6 miles. I mean, like, I don't know if I can walk 2 miles. So that was enjoyable. We would play along the trail that my mother had cut out through the woods. We didn't go walk on the road. And she would always give us a stick and tell us keep hitting the bushes and make sure so we could run the snakes away. But the good part about visiting Grandmama Emma, she had a big old black trunk, and she kept it locked. She had the key always on her waist, which I could never understand. And before we got ready to leave, she would tell us all to line up, and she would open up that trunk, and there was juicy fruit chewing gum in there. Now, it was she had a lot of it in there. But you know what we couldn't understand? She would tear the package open and give each one of us one piece. And we wanted a whole pack. But anyway, it was good to be able to chew that chewing gum all over walking that 6 miles back. And we knew we had to, once the visit over, we had to get home and milk up and take care of the farm. It was always things to do. And matter of fact, I enjoyed the farm. I enjoyed the we used to play, we had several cows, and we would take and squirt milk at one of my siblings in the face. Here, drink this milk. So we did a lot of fun things, and it was a close knit, family. But one time, let me just tell you, my mother used to send me. I used to be the egg collector, had to collect the eggs. And let me tell you, the hen nest was up kind of high. And one day, and being kind of short, I reached over in there. You couldn't see now. I reached over in there to get the eggs and put them in the bucket. I said, Lord have mercy. I grabbed my hand. I came out with this long black snake. And I slung it. So I said, Mama, I'll never gather another egg. Those are some of the fun things that I still reminisce about, Dianne.
It's good to remember the good stuff as well as the tough days.
Exactly.
Dr. Coggeshall, I've got a question for you, and that question came from one of the students and said, of all the discoveries you made in doing your research, which was the most troubling, or actually the student used the term heartbreaking for you? What was something that just really was profound for you?
Uh, well, I'll keep the camera on Mable. I'm not sure. I think the whole story itself, I think probably the most heart-wrenching perhaps was that all the horrific events or all the struggles, maybe a better word, all the struggles that the residents of Liberia went through were not unique to that place. That in fact, in community after community after community, Black community after Black community, from Texas to Maryland, all throughout the South, from the late 19th century all the way into the 1970s, exactly the same thing happened in Black community after Black community after Black community. And so, you know, the struggles and the challenges that the African Americans in Liberia faced were just a microcosm of the kinds of challenges that African Americans throughout the South face, and you know, in many other places in the United States too. And to broaden it even globally, that you know, minority or ethnic minority groups face by dominant cultures around the world. So, on the other hand, the heartwarming part was the resilience, the strength of character that all of these people, including those in Liberia, faced.
Mable, how many years has it been that you've been kind of the backbone and the heart of Soapstone? You said that you made this promise to your mother. How long ago? How long have you been doing this?
I've had about a good 20 years in now that I really just stepped up and, you know, stepped up to the plate. But I returned back to South Carolina in 1983 after, as I told you earlier, I ran away for 23 years. And I came back home after I went to Boston and was able to, even though I graduated with high school education, but I felt that I had to further my education. And I just saw the church was just, people were just leaving, and I said, God, step up, because the door's just gonna close. And I just felt that, I looked around and saw who was left there, and I just felt the need, okay, Mable, it's your turn now. And I felt that my mom and dad had kept the church going so strongly while I had gone away. And I just felt, okay, it's time for me to pick up the pieces. And I know I have been in the fish fry for at least 20 years.
Dr. Coggeshall, maybe in the census data that you've looked at, what was and Mrs. Clarke might be able to answer this too, what was the main reason for people leaving Liberia? Is there a pattern that we see?
Well, it's very characteristic of the South, you know, especially after 1890. A lot of African Americans didn't want to live under the Jim Crow restrictions south, and they headed north for better economic opportunities. But at the same time, you also had the terrorism of lynchings and shootings, and you know, the kind of social pressures and physical pressures that African Americans faced down here, and they didn't face them nearly as much up north. So again, there was that sort of what demographers call push-pull factor. There were factors pushing African Americans out of the South and factors pulling them out of the South too. So it was really a combination of both of those things. And Mable's a perfect example.
Okay, I'll jump in here. I'll just say why I left. Once I graduated from high school, Fairview High School in Eastland, and my dad perhaps drove me around for about 2 months trying to help find a job. I could not get hired any place, not even a job washing dishes. So I was open to whatever I could get. And I said to my mom that well, I kind of did it without her knowing. I had written my brother, who had came out of service in Boston, a letter and asked him if I could come to Boston. And he wrote me back and gave me two conditions that I could come. And one, he told me that high school education would do nothing for me. And he came out of the army there. That's why he had never came back to Liberia, and said he would like for me. I have two nieces that I had not seen. If I could babysit on the weekends so that his wife could go out for socialize. I wrote him back and he said, we'll help you with your tuition to go off to school. But let me just give you the glitch with him. He was, I think he became like my dad, the father role. And he came down and picked me up in July in his car and drove me back. So when we got to New Jersey, he said, okay, we're getting close to Boston, so we need to have a conversation. So I said, okay, I'm open to listen. And he said, as I told you in the letter, you got to follow your education. He said, now what you want to do? You got to remember, I'm from Punkertown. I grew up on a farm, and I'm really not as knowledgeable as he is, because he's pretty much done been around the world in the Army. And I said to him, I think I'll just be a beautician. And, back then I talked real slow and everything. So he said, no, you stand on your feet all day long and you'll make little money. He said, I'm a master electrician, and I knew what I left Liberia with, that I could not make a living for my family. So he said to me, Mable, I watched your niche growing up. He said, I think I know what you could go into. And he indicated, he said, I do electrical work at a lot of the college. And he said, you don't really have to do the 4 years to make a lot of money. So he said, he said, you just always help us with everybody when we sit around, help us with my math. He said, you were always quick with math. He said, you're good with numbers. And he said, I think that's your forte. And I said, he said, I want you to go to accounting school. You can go and do 2 years, and you can come out and you'll be able to stand on your own. So coming from him, that's what he signed me up to do, and that's what I did. So, people leave the South just for a better life, because if I had not left, I would still be out there on the farm, probably had worked in a mill, all of them having the opportunity to work for the government and to work in an office, and I would not have had those opportunities if I had stayed.
Dr. Coggeshall, again, this is from another one of the students. When we talk about slavery, there are so many, and the history of slavery and about these enslaved peoples. Were you ever concerned in working with your primary informant that delving into this history was going to be perhaps traumatic for her? And how do you deal with those kinds of issues?
Well, yes, I figured there would be some episodes that might be difficult. Probably the best way to approach that is from the very first moment that Mable and I sat down together, literally the first thing we did, along with a white friend of hers, is we just negotiated terms. We sat down and said, all right, so I would be willing to write the story of Liberia. And Mable said, why should I share my story with you? Or why should we share our story with you? How can you're going to benefit, I'm going to benefit from this. How can we benefit? And so from the very beginning, I promised a donation to the church, and I promised the royalties for the book sales would go back to the community, which they have. And so based on that grounds of equality or fairness, then we sat up and talked. And as an anthropologist, I fully inform the people that I'm talking to why I'm doing this, who I am, what the purpose is, what the information, where the information's going. And people have the right to continue to talk, or they have the right to not to. They also have the right to say, I don't want to talk about this. I don't force anybody to ask any questions. So everything that they share, they know the conditions under which they're sharing that information, and they know they have the right to refuse anytime they want to. And I always make it very obvious when I'm turning off the tape recorder if they ask me to do so. So Mable entered into, and all the women, all the people that we talked to entered in fully aware of the conditions. So they shared what they wanted to share. And yes, as you can tell, Mabel's stories bring tears to your eyes. And as you can see, they still bring tears to her eyes. And I can see from your faces in Zoom, they bring tears to some of your eyes too. And it's traumatic. But at the same time, again, it's fully voluntary, but it's important that we whites hear that side of the story. I mean, I can tell you, and I know it's one of the other questions, is a lot of the white people just in northern Pickens County, first of all, had no idea Liberia existed in the first place, let alone other Black communities in the past. They had no idea the church was burned. And so part of the challenge of writing the story of Liberia is how can I present the challenges that African Americans face when white history says, oh, we got along great with our neighbors. And so sometimes it's difficult to hear these stories, whether you're African American or not, and or white or not. But I think it's important to hear the stories and to understand the kinds of challenges that real human beings face in real recent times. And I think that's an important part of the story.
Mrs. Clarke, what was the most challenging thing for you, perhaps working with Dr. Coggeshall as he was doing the research?
Well, I would say the most challenging thing for me, I had to dig back into my memories and bring up some things that maybe you just want to forget and not even recollect it again in your mind. But I knew it was important to go ahead, tell the truth, and get it out there. And I guess the reason I say some of the things that's in the book was like, I remember how my parents would say certain things that we couldn't say, don't talk about it, because of the fear that they had. But I had to get past that in order to get the history out there. Even though I could see Dr. Coggeshall sometimes to see when he reflects in my face, look at me in the face, it's like I was struggling, like, do I really put this out? And I recall one time, it was so challenging, we got through talking, and I think Paul Nolan was there with us, another one that has been very inspiring. And I couldn't finish that particular day, I just broke down. And I just had to go back and just sit myself in my own little private closet and said, you gotta get strong, this got to be done. And I had my husband was very supportive, and he kept saying, Mable, you got to let that go and let the truth be known. You can no longer just keep it on the rock. So, but we got through it, Dianne, and we got it in the book, and I hope everybody get an opportunity to read. Go to chapter 5, and they'll see some of the challenging things that I went through. And I think one of the challenging things was for me to tell the story about my brother. That was hard. That was really hard. Because my brother, he killed a person in the neighborhood. Dog just ran out in front of the car. And the next day, when he was coming from the bean field, picking beans, they had blocked the road at the creek to kill him and throw him in the creek. But God prevailed. At the time, they had got him out of the car, busted his face up. My dad come along on the same road, and he jumped out and said, "What is going on?" My brother told this, and they're trying to kill me because I ran over the dog. So that part was challenging for me. And my dad had to deal with that, which I won't get into, but the situation got taken care of by my dad and by my older brother. So I had to, it was a lot of wounds that got opened up that had been buried inside of my heart and my soul for years. But I'm grateful for Dr. Coggeshall. If you ever have the opportunity, he's very persistent. And let's keep going forward. Let's keep going. We got to get it out. And I thank Dr. Coggeshall for that and for this book to be out in history. Even though before I met Dr. Coggeshall, the church tried to go to the different press and get the story printed, and the money that they want to publish a book is astronomical, and we just didn't have the money. And when Dr. Coggeshall came along, he was God sent to Soapstone, and we're just so grateful, and he knows how much we love him. And not only that, we have became the best of friends. Best.
Well, you know, I'm so sorry that you had to go through those opening those wounds again, but by you doing that, it can help all of us heal. And I personally just appreciate it so much, what you've given and the community, and I've seen that you've had your picture in some pretty famous cooking magazines, and then I've seen you on the news just this last week, 2 fraternities from Clemson coming in and working in the graveyard and helping healing that way.
Yes.
With those groups. And so do you have any, do you have a wish list that we could put out there? Maybe think about this later on, a wish list of projects that maybe some of us could come out and help with and work on. And just let us know what we can do in the future to help you.
Okay.
And I think the last question I have is probably for Dr. Coggeshall, although Mable, you might know this. Has there been any effort to get Soapstone in Liberia marked as a state historic site, or put up one of those historical markers? Has any of that been going on?
I don't think any specific kinds of events. Before I let Mable answer that, I just wanted to add one of the most gratifying experiences to me, and I think it reflects the trust between Mable and myself, is during the course of my research, I found that obit of her great-grandmother, as I said, Aunt Katie, and in that obit, it explained where she was buried, and I asked Mable if she knew where her great-grandmother was buried, and Mable said she had no idea. And I told her it was in a cemetery only a couple of miles away. And I remember she choked up and tears came to her eyes, and she thanked me for that. And to me, that was the moment that made all of this work worthwhile. It reminded me of why I'm an anthropologist and the kind of trust necessary between me as a researcher and the community, in this case, the Liberia community that I'm working with, necessary for this kind of intimate, honest, and ultimately it's a positive story event. So I don't think there's any specific kind of historical, I mean, that not directly, but I don't know if maybe you want to ask about that. So I don't know what you've done.
Okay, I have been in touch with David Hyatt, who's one of our councilmen down in Columbia, Pickens County, and trying to get him to put in place to get a marker to be placed in front of the church. And that is in place, but I don't have any particular date or when that's going to be taking place. And then if that doesn't transpire, we have another avenue that we plan to
Well, looking at the clock, I think I could talk to you for a long time or listen to you talk for a long time. But that's our time for our presentation. I want to thank everybody for attending our first Division of Arts and Sciences Speaker Series. And I particularly like to thank Mrs. Clarke and Dr. Coggeshall for just opening our minds and our hearts to not just the community here, but how we are all connected in so many different ways. I want to thank the Speaker Series Committee, GTC Marketing, who helped us a lot with this, Susan Couch, Rachel Cobb, who helped me figure out Zoom, and Dean Takayama for being such a leader with this. And I've learned a lot from this presentation today. I read the book, but there's a lot that's not in the book. And I think Mrs. Clarke is the best teacher here today. And she makes me think of the words of Margaret Mead, a very famous anthropologist. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So I want to thank Mrs. Clarke and Dr. Coggeshall for changing my world today. And I guess we're out of time. So that's our Zoom schedule. Thank you so much. This has been great. Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, I mean, I could stick around if anybody has any questions. Dianne, is that okay?
Sure. If anybody has questions, they can go to chat. I think I can.
Or you can just unmute and.
Oh yeah. Okay. Let me figure that out.
I can look at chat if you want, or.
Okay, I have it fixed so everybody can unmute themselves, I think. Whoops, or maybe not.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Ebony Dura. Thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful. My question is, what are your plans to continue the legacy at Soapstone? Is there someone else that's going to carry the torch and continue the efforts in preserving the story?
I'll respond to that.
Cameras on you.
Already, as I say, we paid the church off. That was phase one. And so as 2021 is here, we're going to, I have already started about 3 months ago, met with a couple of attorneys and with the with Upstate Forever, where the church can be preserved and never sold, and that the Upstate of South Carolina will maintain the grounds and upkeep of the church. So that is in place. And matter of fact, I will be going back in a meeting in the next 2 weeks with the attorneys, and we should start getting everything documented and recorded and put in place before this year is ended.
That is great news. That is great news. Thank you for the update.
You're so welcome.
Anybody else have any questions that they would like to ask?
This is Beth Rohrbach. 2 things. One, if you could put up the link for purchasing the book again. I got most of it down, but I missed the first part.
I figured,
Um,
yeah.
And then the other thing, is there a way for us to keep up with Ms. Clarke in terms of what any of us could do to assist in the, whether it's the upkeep or, just, keeping track of anything that she's going on, the fish fries, those kinds of things?
Yes, I'll respond to that. We have Soapstone is on Facebook. We also have, Soapstone has, Instagram. And also we have, Soapstone has website. And on all of those 3 things that I just mentioned, my phone number is on there. And please feel free to pick it up and call me.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Hi, I have a comment. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is for Ms. Mable. I want to thank you so much for telling your story. As you were talking, that just took me back to Talladega, Alabama, and Kidd Street United Methodist Church. Your story is my family's story. And I want to thank you for even going to the hard places, because I've done family research for about 20 years now. And when I talk to my great auntie and my aunties, I can, just like in your face, I could see your pain. I could see theirs, and I could still tell what they're holding back, but they still decided to tell me anyway. Just thank you so, so much, because it helps us. Sometimes, I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional about this, but my generation and those coming after me, I know people of yours, y'all just looking at us and wondering why we're wilding out. It's because we don't know stuff, and you guys are taking it to your grave and not telling us. So I want to thank you so much for telling your story.
Yes.
And I hope that you are inspiring other people to just say it. I know it hurts you, but just say it. Going back, because I was raised in a church too, they said you're healed by the word of your testimony. You got to get it out. It helps you, and it helps us. So thank you so much. Thank you. That's all I got to say.
Thank you, and come see me. I'd like to meet you.
Okay, I will.
We're all gonna show up at a fish fry.
December the
Yeah.
We'll have dinner on the
Funny
ground.
thing is, I come up there so much. I go to the flea market, and I just never knew that you were just like right up the road. So I will come.
Carolyn, I saw you light up.
So the fish fries are happening now?
It starts
March 20.
March.
March 20th. It open at 11 o'clock. You have to come early because the crowds get there and the food goes fast.
And
It's a great menu. If you don't like fish, you have an option to have pulled pork, hickory smoked chicken, the fried chicken, and you have all kinds of casseroles and just let me tell you, I do all the first food. That was how I was able to get into the Eating Well magazine. I don't do any candy. So I peel sweet potatoes, you have your first candied yams, and you have your first collard greens, and the list goes on and on. It's about 15 items on that hot bar that you can choose from.
We have been there, and I can verify that it's absolutely delicious. So thank you.
Thank you.
And one of the other things, if you do go out, I know sometimes there are members of the community who will give tours of Soapstone and take folks out to the graveyard too. So, make a day trip, take the family, feed them, have some education, and look at that beautiful scenery out there and the good people.
Any other questions?
I have a quick question for both Ms. Clarke and Dr. Coggeshall. Have you guys ever approached Dr. Walter Edgar about maybe appearing on his Walter Edgar's Journal program on South Carolina Public Radio on Friday?
Yeah, I was, if you go to the website, I was interviewed about 2 years ago, and It's available to listen to. It's been replayed a couple of times. In fact, I think they just replayed it January 1st. So,
Oh, great.
yes, I've
Okay.
been on his radio show.
This is a perfect story for
You can
his.
download it and listen to it. Thanks.
I had one other question. It looks like it's being recorded, and how would we be able to access this recording? Because I would love to share it with some of my family members.
I'll have to figure that out.
I totally get it.
I'm doing one step at a time here.
But once you figure it out, I'd love to know about it too.
Oh. I have lots of consultants who help me.
Other questions that people might have?
It looks like it's perhaps time to close things out. And again, thank you so much for doing this with us. And
Yes, thank you.
wish
Feel free
we
to email me if you want to, or you can call Mable if you have additional questions or thoughts. We'll be happy to share.
and I think about what Mable said. Oh, I'm sorry, Anita.
I'm sorry, I was just asking if you could share his email again real quickly.
Okay.
What?
Sorry, we didn't hear that. Your sound broke up.
I'm sorry, I was just asking if he could share his email address real quickly, one more time.
I'll be happy to.
Or one of the other things, if you want to contact me, I can pass the information on as well.
And also, Diane, if anybody wants to, I would just suggest once they leave that they can hit Soapstone Church, and they'll be able to read and get a lot of more information, and they can see the Instagram there, and it would be a lot of current things that's going on at the church.
Okay.
And also there'll be announced about the fish fry each month as well. So just hit Soapstone Church and it'll pop up and you'll see my face flying up there someplace. So stay connected with me, please.
All right.
And the phone number is always listed there.
Okay.
And by the way, we still having church service there, which is, we do streaming on Sunday at 11 o'clock. And you can always check in on that.
Well, I hope to see you in person before too long. And
Okay.
once we get through this pandemic, which, you know, it's going to happen, and come out and enjoy that fresh air, sunshine, and good company. So, and thank all of you for coming, coming to Zoom for this, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.